June 1944. The cliffs of Saipan are alive with echoes, rifle cracks, distant explosions, and the fearful murmuring of hundreds of civilians trapped between war and the unknown. Among them, a group of Japanese women huddle in a cave, children clinging to their kimonos, their faces pale with terror. They have heard that Americans are monsters, tall, merciless, barbaric, and now U.S. Marines are closing in. But on this day, something entirely unexpected happens. A single Marine steps forward alone, without his rifle raised. His name is Guy Gabaldon, Private First Class of the 2nd Marine Division. 19 years old, skinny, calm, and speaking flawless Japanese. "Mina kita kudasai," he calls gently into the darkness. "Please, everyone, listen." What follows is one of the most extraordinary acts of human connection in the entire Pacific War. To understand how a teenager from Los Angeles ended up serving as a bridge of trust between terrified Japanese civilians and advancing American forces, we need to start years earlier, long before Saipan's cliffs echoed with gunfire. Guy Gabaldon was not Japanese. He was a Mexican-American kid raised in a poor neighborhood in East LA. But at the age of 12, he was unofficially adopted by the Nakano family, a Japanese-American household living nearby. He ate dinner at their table, learned their customs, studied their language, and absorbed their culture down to the smallest detail. By 14, he spoke Japanese like a native, so well that he could mimic regional accents. And by 15, he worked in their family store, chatting effortlessly with Japanese immigrants who visited each week. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Nakanos were sent to internment camps by their own government. Gabaldon, furious and heartbroken, promised that if he ever served in the Pacific, he would use the language the Nakanos taught him, not to hurt anyone, but to save lives. 2 years later, he enlisted in the Marines. On Saipan, Gabaldon was officially assigned as a scout, but he had a habit, one his officers initially hated, of sneaking out at night, alone, deep into Japanese-held territory. Instead of shooting, he talked. Instead of threatening, he persuaded. Instead of demanding, he empathized. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Over days of fighting, Gabaldon convinced more than 1,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender peacefully, something no other Marine had ever achieved at that scale. But of all the stories, the most emotionally powerful unfolded deep inside a cave on the slopes of Saipan's Marpi Point. As Marines advanced and Japanese defenders retreated, women and children found themselves caught in the chaos. Japanese propaganda had convinced them that capture by Americans meant torture or death. Many believed suicide was the only honorable option. Some carried grenades, ready to kill themselves and their families. That's why what Gabaldon did next mattered so profoundly. He approached the cave alone. Other Marines held back, waiting, whispering that he was insane. He heard movement inside, shuffling feet, hushed cries, whispered instructions from an older woman urging the younger ones not to surrender. Gabaldon raised his voice again. "Anata tachi wa anzen desu," he said gently. "You are safe. Please come out. I promise you will not be harmed." The cave went silent. For long seconds, the only sound was the distant rumble of artillery. Then a child began crying, loud, panicked, inconsolable. Gabaldon softened his tone even further. "I know you are afraid. I know what you've been told about us, but I give you my word. You will not be touched. You will not be separated. I will stay with you until you are safe." Then he added something no Japanese civilian expected to hear from an American uniform. "I was raised by a Japanese family. I honor them by protecting you now." Inside the cave, the women froze. For the first time in weeks, hope cracked through fear. The eldest woman asked, voice trembling, "Doshite, naze nihongo o hanaseru no desu ka?" Why? Why do you speak Japanese? Gabaldon answered, "Because the people who taught me your language were good, loving people, and so are you. Please, let me help you." Slowly, cautiously, a pair of hands holding a white cloth appeared from the darkness. Then another, then another. 12 women stepped into the sunlight, shaking, their children clinging to their legs. Many were barefoot. Some were bleeding. All were terrified. Gabaldon motioned to the Marines behind him to lower their weapons. The women gasped. American rifles pointed downward. No yelling, no violence. This was not what they had been taught to expect. A younger woman asked him quietly, "Will my children live?" Gabaldon knelt so he was eye level with her 3-year-old son and replied, "Yes, they will live, and they will be treated with respect." Then he bowed, Japanese style, one of the deepest bows a man in combat gear could physically manage. That gesture, simple, human, respectful, broke the fear that propaganda had cemented for years. The women burst into tears. Some collapsed to their knees. Others hugged their children so tightly that the kids cried out in protest. One woman repeated, "Arigato, arigato," over and over, as if the words alone might guarantee their safety. Gabaldon guided them away from the cliffs, blocking their view of nearby bodies and destruction. He kept speaking softly, reassuringly, telling them what to expect when they reached the marine lines: food, water, medical treatment. No separation, no humiliation, no execution. When the group finally reached the American perimeter, the scene stunned the Marines. An entire column of Japanese women and children walked calmly behind a single 19-year-old Marine, trusting him completely. A sergeant stared and muttered, "What in God's name?" Gabaldon replied simply, "They were scared. Someone just had to tell them the truth." But the story didn't end there. Word spread, fast. More civilians hiding in caves began listening for the young Marine who spoke like one of their own. Many called him the boy who speaks like home. Over the coming days, Gabaldon talked hundreds more out of caves, off cliff edges, and away from suicide grenades. He told them, "You deserve to see tomorrow. War is for soldiers. Civilians should not die here." And women, who had been taught since childhood that surrender was shameful, began stepping into American custody not with shame, but with relief. Historians estimate that over the course of the Saipan and Tinian campaigns, Gabaldon personally persuaded more than 1,300 civilians and soldiers to surrender, an achievement unmatched by any other Marine in the Pacific War. But it is this moment, his voice echoing into a dark cave, reaching terrified women who expected death, that stands as the purest example of his courage. This was not courage with a rifle. It was courage with compassion. Courage with language. Courage that saved lives instead of taking them. Many years later, survivors of Saipan remembered him not as an enemy, but as a young man who appeared from the smoke of war speaking their mother tongue, offering safety when they believed none existed. And for Gabaldon, that was the greatest victory of all. After the first women emerged from the cave, Guy Gabaldon knew the mission was far from finished. All across Saipan, more civilians hid in fear, some in caves so deep that even daylight could barely slip in, others perched on cliffsides convinced that jumping to their death was better than surrendering. Gabaldon refused to let fear claim them. On the second morning, he approached another cluster of caves, this one even larger, dozens of families crammed together, whispering, trembling, many clutching grenades handed to them by Japanese officers who told them Americans would torture them. Gabaldon stood at the entrance and called out in Japanese, "Please listen. The war has reached you, but that does not mean you must die for it. Your children need you. Come out peacefully, and I will walk with you." A man inside shouted angrily, calling him a trickster, an impostor. But Gabaldon didn't waver. "I was raised in your culture," he called back. "I know what honor means to you, but raising your children to live is honor. Protecting your family is honor. Surviving is not shameful." There was a long silence. Then he heard something unexpected. An elderly woman began singing softly. It was a traditional lullaby, the kind the Nakano mother once sang to him when he'd visited their home in East L.A. Her voice cracked, trembling with both grief and hope. Gabaldon swallowed hard. He replied by singing the next verse, perfectly, just as he had learned it years before. Inside the cave, murmurs erupted. "He knows our songs," someone whispered. That moment shifted the entire atmosphere. When the singing faded, Gabaldon spoke again, quietly but firmly. "I promise you, if you come out, you will live. I will not let anyone harm you." Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. First a mother carrying a newborn, then a grandmother leaning on a young girl's shoulder. Then more, men with shaking hands, women wiping tears from soot-stained cheeks, children blinking nervously in the sunlight. Gabaldon led them down the slope, speaking in gentle tones, warning them about uneven ground, helping them step around fallen branches. He made sure none of them had to look at the horrors of the battlefield. Behind them, Marines lowered their weapons, stunned once again. That night, Gabaldon barely slept. He couldn't stop thinking about the people still trapped beyond the lines, People taught their entire lives that surrender was shameful. People who had been told Americans would kill them without hesitation. He couldn't shake the image of the widow clutching her baby, whispering, "I didn't think we would see the sun again." So the next morning, he went out again, against direct orders. His commanders had already reprimanded him once for going out alone. They feared he'd be killed, captured, or worse. But Gabaldon believed deeply that saving civilians mattered as much as taking ground. He approached another cave system, this one controlled by both civilians and several wounded soldiers. The soldiers were hesitant, the civilians terrified. Gabaldon called out, "I know you've been told Americans are monsters, but if that were true, would I be speaking to you like this? Would I be telling you to bring your children to safety?" A wounded Japanese corporal responded angrily, telling Gabaldon to leave. But the women behind him were listening, their fear palpable. Gabaldon could hear babies crying. He heard a man muttering prayers. He listened to the sound of fabric rustling as someone clenched a grenade. He knew he had only seconds before desperation turned fatal, so he stepped closer and spoke with all the conviction he possessed. "Your children deserve to grow up. Your mothers and fathers deserve to see tomorrow. Do not let propaganda take your lives. Do not let fear decide your fate. Come out. I will protect you from harm." A long pause followed. Then he heard it, a soft shuffle. A woman stepped out carrying two small boys. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Is it really safe?" Gabaldon nodded. "Yes, I give you my word." He extended his hand. She hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers in his palm. When she did, the others followed, first cautiously, then urgently, as if breaking free from a nightmare. But not everyone emerged. Two wounded Japanese soldiers limped forward, refusing help but refusing to harm civilians. They bowed to Gabaldon, something unheard of amid the brutal fighting. Then they said, "Take care of them, please." Gabaldon bowed back, deeply moved. As he led the group downhill, a Marine lieutenant approached, shaking his head in disbelief. "How many did you bring out this time?" Gabaldon glanced back at the long line of civilians behind him and replied softly, "As many as would listen." By the time the Saipan campaign ended, hundreds had surrendered because of his voice. And still, Gabaldon wasn't finished. Weeks later, during the battle for Tinian, he continued his missions, talking frightened civilians out of caves, persuading soldiers who were ready to die, comforting mothers who believed they'd never see peace again. One woman later recalled, "The American boy spoke to us as if he were family. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He asked us to live." Gabaldon's methods were so effective that some Marines started calling him the Pied Piper of Saipan, a nickname he never liked, but one that captured his unique ability to draw people out of hiding with nothing more than words. But behind the legend was a young man carrying an emotional burden most soldiers never faced. He had seen the aftermath of Banzai charges. He had watched families clutch grenades to their chests. He had looked into the eyes of mothers who believed death was their children's only escape, and he refused to let those tragedies repeat. After the war, Gabaldon returned home and reunited with the Nakano family, the very people who had given him the language and cultural understanding that saved so many lives. He visited them often and thanked them for what they taught him, telling them, "You helped me save people on the other side of the ocean." In later interviews, Gabaldon reflected on his wartime actions with humility. "I didn't think of myself as brave," he said. "I just couldn't stand the thought of civilians dying because no one told them the truth. If I could talk them out of dying, that's what I was going to do." Historians have debated some of the numbers, but not the core truth. Gabaldon's actions were extraordinary. His ability to communicate, empathize, and build trust in the midst of chaos stands as one of the greatest humanitarian achievements of the Pacific War. He received the Silver Star, which was later upgraded to the Navy Cross, one of the highest honors awarded by the Marines. Many believe he deserved the Medal of Honor. But Gabaldon cared more about the lives he saved than about medals. As he grew older, he often spoke about the power of language, how understanding a culture could break barriers even during the brutality of war. "If you speak to people in their own language," he said, "you speak to their hearts, not just their ears." He remained proudest of the moment when those first terrified women stepped out of the Saipan cave. trusting him despite everything they had been told. That moment, he said, showed him that even in war, humanity could survive. If we can reach people through words, he once told a historian, maybe the world doesn't have to keep learning the hard way. Today, the story of Guy Gabaldon is a reminder that compassion can achieve what firepower cannot, a reminder that understanding can overcome fear, and a reminder that sometimes the bravest act on a battlefield is not taking a life, but saving one. So when we remember the great battles of the Pacific, Saipan, Tinian, the Marianas, we should also remember the young Marine who walked alone into caves filled with terror, speaking softly in the language of the people he hoped to save. Because in a war defined by destruction, Guy Gabaldon proved that one voice, one promise, and one act of courage can change the fate of hundreds. And that is how an American translator calmed terrified Japanese women during surrender negotiations. Not with orders, not with threats, but with empathy, language, and the belief that even in the darkest moments of history, humanity still has the power to shine.